To live is to change. To be perfect is to have changed often. Those were among the first words to greet me when I was assigned here nearly 29 years ago now. They were the words etched on a painting that was hanging in what's now the library, that was the classroom for the CSC when I came. They're the words of a man named John Henry Newman. Those words very much described his life. They should describe ours as well. To live is to change. To be perfect is to have changed often. First, his life. John Henry Newman was, like you who are our students here, a brilliant, brilliant young man. He was an intellectual. He appreciated deeply the life of his mind. He was passionate about being a student. His education was nothing he ever took for granted. His passion was learning and teaching and writing philosophy and ultimately poetry. As a matter of fact, the poem we will sing after Communion Day as a reflection will be his poem. This painting here was a painting of Newman as a young man by Ed Bocha, the same artist who did the mural and the Pilgrim Virgin. Newman's conversion was intellectual. There's a lot of ways of coming to God and coming to the church. His was thoroughly intellectual. He was a thinker, and in the end it was his thinking that had some of the greatest impact on the teachings of the Second Vatican Council of our church that ended when I was just in 7th grade, that we're still, as a church, trying to unpack for the world. But it was thinking that left him reeling with questions. He was a natural skeptic, but his mind was not something that he was willing to leave back there at the door of the church. He wanted his mind to be welcome too, or he could not belong. He wanted his mind, his thinking, his reason to be valued by the church he chose. Religion, if he's going to espouse it, needed to include his mind, and he needed it to be reasonable. His faith had to work well with reason, the gift of his reason, even though he knew that faith can never be thoroughly understood, nor can it be absolutely proved. But it had to be reasonable. 10,000 questions does not a doubt make, he would say. 10,000 questions will not a doubt make. And in his relentless search for the truth, he asked well more than 10,000 questions. His search for truth led him to the Anglican Church, where he became a priest. And then his search for the truth led him even more deeply through the theology and the beauty of our church, the Roman Catholic Church. That most difficult decision of his life, he would say, was the best. He had blood, sweat, and tears going into that decision. He knew it'd be ostracized by the Church of England because he was an Englishman. He knew it was going to cost him everything in the beginning, and it did. He would say it was his best decision, and definitely not without suffering. Being a convert, his theology was often suspect. When St. Paul converted to being a follower of Jesus after being persecutor of Jesus' followers, he was suspect. The early church, the apostles, were very suspicious of his motives. He was already trying to kill Christians. Is this a way for him to infiltrate the early incipient community of Christians? Was this his way of infiltrating like a terrorist into the church to explode what was beginning there? So his theology, Newman's theology, being new to this and having a lot of Church of England thoughts in his head, was very suspect. His ideas were new to some and scary to others, and that remained true throughout his life, and still. Some accused him of heresy. He was vilified in print, and even then, the Pope, that then Pope, denounced his thinking publicly, only to have the next Pope make him a cardinal. By the way, speaking of cardinals, I'm wearing the rally squirrel today. It's knit into the vestments. John Henry Newman's new religion did not make it easy for him. Theologians on the right in the church would criticize him, and they're still criticizing him because they don't want him to be canonized. But those on the left were suspicious too, because he said in the same breath that the church could change, that the church can't change. Neither of the extremes of the church then or now trust him all the way. I hear his life resonant with the words of the prophet Habakkuk in today's first reading. In the prophet's words, the vision still has its time. It presses on to fulfillment. It will not disappoint. If it delays, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not come too late. The rash one, the impatient one has no integrity, but the just one, because of his faith, shall live. The vision will have its time. If we're not patient in it coming true, even perhaps beyond our life, we're the fool. These things take time. Where Newman took the greatest hit, the hardest hit, was in his theory that dogma, the doctrine of our church, can develop. Just like our thinking can develop, can change. That the teaching of the church can change. The teaching of the church can change, he posited, for the first time really to the world. That scares so many, and even as it excites so many others. So many want our church to be the one thing in this crazy world in their whole life that does not change. They want the church to be the one secure thing. And that is so understandable, especially given the world. Yet we belong already to a church that can change and that cannot change. We can provide the date, we can provide the circumstances where the teachings of the church have changed. They've already changed. One popular one is usury. For 1,000 years, usury was considered intrinsically evil, a serious moral issue, a sin for which people could be excommunicated. Usury is lending money for money. 1,000 years that went on. And finally, Pope after Pope condemned it, and it got a little bit whittled away at, and then the people kind of said, this isn't a big deal. And all of a sudden, the Pope started swerving the other way. Does that mean that the church was wrong in condemning it for 1,000 years? Something that was considered wrong and immoral, intrinsically evil in that particular instance became moral. That's a change. And there are other issues that have changed over the years that were acceptable, like slavery, like even in our own day, the death penalty. Those were considered acceptable things, and now they no longer are. Slavery is an intrinsic evil. It's absolutely immoral. But for it took us about 1,600 years to say that, maybe even longer. So some things that were wrong became appropriate, acceptable, and amoral, depending on how they were used, and some things that were considered not a sin have become sins for us. The fact is, the church has changed. It has changed. None of us are eager for change to come in our life. None of us want to change. We don't go into it usually thinking, oh my gosh, I can change my mind today. Changing our minds, changing our lives, it's always resisted at first by the community at large and by our own self. We resist change. But God help us if we're not willing to change our minds and our lives. God help us. And God help our marriages and our friendships if we're not willing to change our minds and our hearts along the way, nothing will happen. It'll get stagnant if we can't change one or the other, hopefully both. God help the church, if she's not made up of people who change and must, to be in this world that is always changing all around us and deserves to be listened to as yet another source of truth. Deserves to be listened to. Believe it or not, it was Newman himself who invited the church to consult the laity, that's you, on matters of truth, and to listen to your common sense of what's right and wrong, to your common sense, the common sense of the people, to help us figure this out. That was Newman's contribution. It's now in the law of the church and theology that while Scripture is a source of truth and the teaching church is a source of truth, the bishops and the Pope, so are you now a source of truth the church needs to listen to. That's you, and that was from Newman. Your common sense regarding the church and its teaching matters now, thanks to Newman. And while each of us changes, we're still at the core of ourselves the same person, true? So does the church have to change and also remain true to itself so that in us that cannot change? In the spirit of Cardinal Newman, it takes an enormous amount of patience and some thick skin to put a new idea out there that might not be all that new once it's grounded in the tradition, in the past, and people's experiences over the centuries. But it takes an enormous amount of patience and some thick skin because we're going to get pushed against. It's resistance will always be. In your family, if you put out a new idea on what to do on a Sunday afternoon, you're going to get resistance, probably from your teenagers, right? But never can we be without a soft and a feeling heart if we're going to remain true to the vision that Habakkuk held up for us. Though it's so far from being accomplished, it's really our empathy that begins to change the church. There's this teaching that's been held, and now our experience of empathy and the common sense of the people that starts to change when it's time, if it is meant to be. That's how it'll show up for us. We can never stop learning. We can never stop seeking the truth, you and I. For that reason, you're partly responsible for the future of the church. The future of the church in 3019 AD will be the church it is partly because of the common sense of the people of God that you are in 2019 AD. If you're seeking the truth yourself, consulting and learning all the time. Never stop learning about your faith. Never stop learning about your hope and reasons for hope. And never stop learning about love, about how to give and receive love. The world, the future of the world needs that. And it will help purge the church. And in the spirit of Cardinal Newman, this Newman community and this whole Newman movement in the United States especially, but worldwide, but especially in this country, this Newman community was founded on what he did, how he thought, and especially his desire to engage his mind with his faith. The university mattered to him. He wrote about the university and how it can be its best. He valued learning, and he wants the church to be on campuses, just like we are, so that faith and reason can work together, never not work together. He didn't want the life of the mind to lose the life of faith and vice versa. I always imagine that there's a way to do our lives or to lead, whether it's in our families or the church and business and friendship, even in your marriages, that there's a way to do it without facing so much resistance. Is there a way that somebody can put out a new idea without all this pushback all the time? New ideas, but new ideas are resisted. And change towards these new ideas is resisted. And if we don't have the words of the prophet echoing inside of us, we will bail. The innovative leader, the creative leader, the one who thinks outside the box, he or she will quit the church, quit being a participant in the government, just be resigned and not doing anything active anymore. We will bail. We will go back to the way things were in our own personal lives and in our marriages, just to not stir up the waters, because it hurts too much to stir up the waters, to think outside the box. We will bail on the church, we'll bail on our jobs, we'll bail on our friendships and on our marriages if that resistance is too much. And that's a shame, because it's just then that things get interesting. Just last night, I was at a wedding reception. I was sitting next to an alumni of the university who was raised without faith, I found out there, and had no faith. And he leaned over to me and he said, "Can I ask you a question?" And then drum roll, please. How do you continue to be part of an institution that you'll never see the change you long for ever accomplished in your lifetime? How can you do that? The change you want, the change you think would make the church a better church for the world, you'll probably never see it in your whole life. How do you do that? I thought of Newman right away, actually, because he is obviously on my mind, who did not bail, who suffered the resistance with hope. The seed, the gospel that Luke tells us about, planted in the ground, those were his ideas, not disconnected from the history of the church. It was there, but he's the first to really put it out there, and the resistance was enormous. He was shredded, but he didn't bail. As a matter of fact, and this is the truth as I know it, the seed he planted has become an enormous tree now through Vatican Council II and into the church and into a whole new way of understanding what's true, good, and beautiful. But it took 100 years. How did Habakkuk say that again? If it delays, wait for it. It will come. It won't be too late. The rash one has no integrity. The one whose impatience gets him, that's a loss of integrity. But to stay true, the just one will know. How many great ideas in the history of the world do the people who planted those ideas never lived long enough to see? It's just then, my friends, that resistance seems the hardest. When resistance seems the hardest, we're about to make the breakthrough. Change happens. Next Sunday, as probably most of you know, and the reason we're talking about Newman a week ahead is because next Sunday I'm privileged to be in the Vatican for the candidate. It just chokes me up because I've been talking about him for 29 years, living under his picture for 29 years, praying to him, through him. But it's really exciting to me that I get to be a participant in his canonization. Pope Francis is there in the center of the universal church that Cardinal Newman chose as his own and never left. There, just above the bones of the first Pope, St. Peter, there, where all these layers of tradition had happened from Peter to Francis, there, I will stand and I will hear our Pope exclaim to the world that we have a new saint, St. John Cardinal Newman. So you see, the vision really can come true. Still has its time, does press on to fulfillment, and will not disappoint. If it does delay, wait for it. It will surely come. Indeed, to live, to be human, is to change. To be perfect is to have changed often.